Hi, I'm Kirsten Moore. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Marie Curie Palliative Care Research Department. So my research looks at dementia and end-of-life care, and I have a particular focus on the grief that family carers experience while they're looking after someone with dementia. I've interviewed 150 family carers. I'm doing a senior fellowship with the Alzheimer Society, and we've talked to carers about their experiences of grief, whether they recognise their grieving, what sort of supports they've sought for dealing with that grief. And we've also looked at how it relates to other issues such as depression, their coping strategies, whether their understanding and knowledge about dementia and their preparation for end of life. So when we talk about preparation for end of life, we might be thinking about things like whether they have an advanced care plan in place, whether they've talked to the person about dementia while they still have capacity about what they might want in terms of care at end of life. And so we think that this is really tied in closely with grief before death as well. So that's what my study is really interested in looking at. So I think this research is really important to help recognise and bring attention to the issue of grief and help service providers recognise grief. So hopefully we'll have strategies for helping to identify when carers are grieving and help them acknowledge and understand that they're going through a grieving process. A lot of research on family carers is focused on depression and carer burden, but I think there's been a bit of neglect of research looking at carer grief while someone's caring. And I think grief is a really important aspect because the nature of dementia can make it a more complicated process. And while grief's a normal part of life and death, I think the dementia process and the long time that dementia takes to progress and develop can complicate that. So what we find is that adult children might find that while they used to look up to a parent or go to them for advice, they feel that there's been a role reversal and that parent is now relying on them to make decisions and to be sort of the independent person. Spouses often talk about the difficulties associated with transition to a care home. They might feel like their whole marriage is over because the person they've shared a house with for their whole life or for their whole marriage is no longer there with them. Things like their retirement might be interrupted, what they were planning to do and travel and things like that, those plans might be interrupted. Another loss that carers experience is that when the person no longer recognises them, and that can be a really challenging point because they feel like, well, who is this person? Is this still my parent? Is it still my mother or my father? So that can be another really emotional and difficult time for family carers. So recognising grief, I think, is a really important part of understanding and dealing with grief, and so that's what my study is sort of focusing on. So the findings from my research, we've found that most carers do recognise and do acknowledge that they experience grief. And one of our interesting findings was that 55% of carers were seeking professional support for the grief that they were experiencing. So either going to a GP or a counsellor to support the emotions that they were going through. So this is quite in contrast to bereavement guidelines in the UK, which suggests that around a very small proportion of people will require professional support to sort of go through a grieving process. Or they talk about figures around 10%. So this suggests that there is a much greater need, and it does also highlight some gaps in terms of service provision. Are bereavement services providing support to family carers while they're caring for someone with dementia and before the death of a person with dementia, which is often a trigger for bereavement support services. So another key finding we found was that more women were experiencing grief than men, and much higher intensity of grief. And we also found, as we expected, that those who reported a more substantial change in the closeness of their relationship with a person with dementia, that they were much more likely to be having higher intensity grief as well. And when we looked at issues around preparation for end of life, we didn't actually find that if the carer had talked to the person with dementia about their preferences for end of life care, that made any difference to the grief that the family was experiencing. And also if they had something like an enduring power of attorney or sort of advanced care plan, a written directive around end of life care, that also didn't influence the intensity of grief. What we did find was things like social support, how well supported the family carer felt, to a lesser degree their relationship and quality of information from healthcare professionals, and also their knowledge of dementia, how well they understood how dementia progressed, all were associated with feeling sort of lower levels of grief intensity. So these are sort of things that we think, well, these are modifiable things. How we educate people about dementia and how it progresses are something that we can possibly modify with services. So this is where my next sort of research will hopefully look at different interventions and how we might be able to help carers process and cope with that grief. So now we're using information from all the data we collected. We're going to work with carers and service providers, so counsellors that work with people with dementia and family carers, as well as nurses, Dementia UK, Admiral Nurses and Alzheimer's Society. And we're going to develop a resource, an animation and an infographic that sort of captures the key kind of information that we want to pass across and help raise awareness of grief amongst family carers.